American troops had been in Vietnam for a long time and knew well that with the onset of the monsoon season, all rules of combat operations changed dramatically. For several months, heavy rains persisted without pause, turning the airspace over the country into a continuous storm and the roads into impassable flows of mud and water. During such periods, aircraft could hardly take off or land on the front lines, and movement along ground routes became almost impossible as all roads turned into rivers of mud, difficult even to cross. Under these conditions, the only group capable of continuing to strike the enemy was the so-called Mobile River Force, a coalition of combat ships patrolling the submerged branches of the Mekong Delta. These combat vessels, protected by armor and armed with the latest technology, armored transport ships, navigated narrow waterways where their hulls were packed with infantry units and combat vehicles such as M113 armored personnel carriers. The decks of these ships were lined with 50 caliber machine guns and fire-throwing installations capable of quickly destroying any Viet Cong fortifications encountered along their path. But in the Vietnam War, the enemy was not the only threat. The river itself, along which the combat ships traveled, could turn against them at any moment. The water would narrow or become shallow, and soon the vessels could barely move, getting stuck in sand and mud. Thus, the last means of amphibious warfare available to the U.S. was under threat. However, the Marines and sailors refused to surrender. The Mobile River Force always pressed forward, regardless of the circumstances, even if they had to fight against the wildest nature, the Delta and its dangerous waters. The USS Harnett County, affectionately called Harnett County, was a combat ship that once plied the waters of the Pacific Ocean south of the American coast. 20 years ago, this ship participated in the battles leading to the surrender of Imperial Japan, when captains and crews fought for victory and freedom on the same waters. Now, after major repairs and modernization, the ship had returned to sea. It was equipped with guns of limited caliber and had a special helicopter deck, a sort of airstrip. Reinstated in service, it was assigned to a new combat mission, to force yet another Asian adversary to surrender, preventing the spread of the conflict and averting an even larger war. It has been 2 years since the start of the American military campaign in Vietnam, and despite all efforts, the end of this war still remained beyond the horizon. American bombers tirelessly dropped bombs on the northern part of the country, hoping to break the resistance of the communists, but they continued to hold out. In the southern part, American troops penetrated dense jungles that seemed all-consuming, like a living organism. Everywhere, through tunnels, villages, behind every tree and bush, the enemy lurked, ready to strike at any moment. Under such conditions, the U.S. Navy and ground forces had to deploy their full arsenal. But when the Harnett County reached the shores of Vietnam, it had to stop. Advancing further was impossible because shallow waters and shoals could trap her hull in mud and leave her immobile. To continue the operation, the command made a decision. The ship's crew abandoned their positions and transferred to smaller combat vessels, so-called river patrol boats, or patrol boats, river. Each boat they encountered along the way represented a potential threat, hiding dangerous enemies carrying weapons arsenals. Every vessel, regardless of how unassuming it appeared, had to be stopped and inspected. Patrols were required to thoroughly question every passenger, carefully examining all hidden spots under fruit baskets or grain sacks for concealed explosives and weapons. For several weeks, communist forces closely monitored the American patrols, exploiting gaps in their river routes. They quietly concentrated near the South Vietnamese city of Mythi, waiting for the right moment to strike at American positions. American boats were vulnerable. They moved slowly. Their engines struggled against the current in open water, and they had no cover or quick course-changing capabilities. If the enemies, in this case the Viet Cong, decided to launch a first strike, setting an ambush either from the shore or using fast boats, sampans loaded with explosives and armed fighters, the Americans would be caught in a trap. But before the enemies could begin their attack, crucial intelligence arrived. It reported the suspected Viet Cong hideout. There was no time to confirm the information. All patrol groups in the area received orders to immediately abandon their current missions and head to the enemy's presumed stronghold. However, even after learning the enemy's location, it was difficult for them to spot him amid the murky brown waters and the endless jungle stretching along both sides of the river. For hours, they carefully examined every bend in the river, watching for every flicker of moving shadows behind the reeds. Larger vessels anchored on the shore could not descend further downstream to support the operation, but from their decks, attack helicopters soared into the sky, designed to detect signs of moving enemy forces among the trees. Support for the water patrols was also provided by ground forces from South Vietnam. Part 3 of 10. They were tasked with scouting suspicious areas, cutting through dense thickets and following the slow progress of the naval forces along the river in hopes of launching a surprise attack from both sides. As these soldiers pushed through the tangled underbrush, one of them suddenly spotted a shadow flickering between the trees. Cautiously approaching, he heard a gunshot. A single round whistled past him just inches away. The other soldiers couldn't determine where the shot had come from when suddenly a hail of gunfire erupted. The situation on the river was developing very rapidly. It was already too late to notice warning signals. Explosions burst along the shores, and bullets ricocheted across the water like stones thrown into a pond. Patrol boats responded with machine gun fire, shooting toward the trees to suppress enemy firing points. At the same time, Viet Cong fighters, noticing the return fire, quickly retreated into the dense forest. For a short time, silence settled over the river, but the participants of the mobile river forces understood perfectly. It was only a temporary lull. They knew that a new shelling could begin at any moment. Without losing a second, the mobile river forces team took up combat positions. Although their boats were small and seemed vulnerable, in terms of strength they outnumbered and outgunned the enemy. Each attack-ready group consisted of dozens of armored combat vehicles known as Tango. These powerful transport vehicles, heavily armed and ready for battle. Their decks were equipped with weaponry capable of inflicting significant damage on the enemy, and each such vehicle was part of an organized and coordinated system that could quickly and effectively respond. Large, powerful 45mm machine guns, their hulls extended wide enough to accommodate not only the M113 armored personnel carrier, but also nearly 40 soldiers standing shoulder to shoulder, prepared to storm the shores. Nearby, floating ships, observers and combat boats, moved equipped with 81mm mortars, resembling giant cannons ready to fire salvo after salvo directly into the line of trees on the shore. Fast landing craft raced just behind, their grenade launchers loaded and ready for combat, while specialized ships, refuelers, supplied the flotilla with fuel so it could continue fighting day and night without returning to base. At this moment, the boats opened fire. The gun turrets lit up brightly, and shells rained down on the suspected positions of the militants, the Viet Cong fighters. Suddenly, a missile burst from the jungle, a B-40, followed by explosions from 57mm recoilless rifles. One missile struck directly into the Tango, the enemy combat vehicle, shaking its steel hull and causing a wave of vibrations across the water. Metal shrapnel sliced through the air like precise arrows. Several soldiers were thrown onto the deck, wounded by shrapnel that cut through skin and flesh. But the boat withstood the impact. Despite the shock, it remained afloat, and its crew continued firing. The mobile river unit continued to fire blindly into the jungle ahead, hoping to hit something in the greenery. The battle raged on until the river was once again shrouded in silence. Thick smoke hung over the water's surface, and only the faint hum of boat engines could be heard. American and South Vietnamese forces quickly adapted to prevent the enemy from escaping. The boats blocked the river exits, while infantry rushed to the shores, dispersing into nearby villages. But before they could fully secure the area, the enemies returned at night to strike against the Allied forces. Radio stations crackled, and commanders argued over whether to continue the operation, ultimately deciding to halt further offensive actions. When the mission ended, the Americans confirmed that at least 83 Viet Cong militants and agents had been identified and detained, and several fortified positions destroyed. However, 10 U.S. soldiers were killed in action, along with no fewer than 28 Vietnamese fighters. Dozens more were wounded. Many returned to the boats with burned feet in blisters after long hours spent wading through swampy mud up to their waists. Nevertheless, the mobile river group could not afford to stop. For nearly half a year, heavy rains poured over the Mekong Delta in Vietnam, like a curtain concealing the land. Lightning and thunder disrupted plans. Aircraft could not fly, reconnaissance became impossible, and roads turned into rivers of mud. Any ground operation during these months seemed like true hell. Heavy armor became stuck in viscous mud, and infantry struggled to move, trying to break through the swampy mass. The enemy exploited this window to rebuild destroyed fortifications, hideouts, and caches, as well as to strengthen their positions in old strongholds that seemed already taken. Under such conditions, the Mobile River Group could not afford to sit idly by. Its task was to prevent the enemy from consolidating and resuming their advance, so it was constantly active despite the hardships and dangers. Against the backdrop of long, relentless storms raging for an entire month, a special role among the Allied forces was played by the so-called Mobile River Group, or, as it was often called, the MRG. It was one of the few combat-capable units able to continue active operations despite all the natural obstacles caused by heavy rains and flooding. Their ships easily cut through overgrown and eroded waterways, and the MRG itself served as a mobile strike platform that helped keep the Viet Cong guerrillas under control, hindered their actions, and restrained their advances. When the monsoon rains arrived in the mid-1960s, in the year 1966, this group launched a series of raids into the Mekong Delta. These operations later became known as Coronato, named after one of the most famous campaigns. Initially, the commanders of the boat patrols feared that their troops would face the same terrifying scenes as at the beginning of the year, when they had already been attacked during sudden ambushes and bloody clashes. However, to their surprise, instead of unexpected assaults, the forces of the MRD gradually began to transform into true masters of river navigation. Their soldiers confidently and accurately handled the boats, as if they had grown up in these marshy and tangled waters, as if they had spent their entire lives among these waterways. Enemy fire subsided, and more prisoners were captured without any losses among the American soldiers. This entire water-based battle began to give the United States the advantageous position so necessary for victory in this part of the conflict. In August, a new intelligence report arrived at the base located within the Mobile Riverine Group. The information indicated that approximately 30 miles from their outpost, another enemy group was forming. The ships quickly set off in pursuit along the river, trying to approach the suspected enemy concentration site. But when they reached the designated point, they encountered an unexpected situation. The Mekong suddenly changed its course, and the water in the river narrowed and became shallower, forming strips with strong currents and a high amount of silt. These areas proved to be so dangerous and difficult that even their small, shallow draft boats could not pass further. As a result, the ships were forced to stop and proceed on foot. After several hours of moving through shallow waters and along overgrown paths teeming with mud and silt, the American infantry finally spotted movement ahead. A glance through the intertwining palms and reeds revealed a fortified enemy village deep in the jungle, a Viet Cong guerrilla stronghold, partially submerged in the shadows of dense trees. These fortifications were weakly defended, which was quite logical. The enemy probably did not expect that American forces could penetrate so far into the delta during the monsoon rains. This was an ideal opportunity to strike. Quietly and carefully, trying not to make any noise, the soldiers began to approach the target. They moved slowly, like shadows, creeping toward the fortified settlement until they were within striking distance. Suddenly, as if a thunderclap in a clear sky, a volley erupted, and the enemy was struck by gunfire. Bullets sliced through the water, flying directly into the camp, where the enemies, stunned and confused, tried to understand what was happening. Caught off guard, the Viet Cong began to panic and flee, rushing into the jungle. Meanwhile, the boats with rivercraft positioned too far behind could not assist in this battle, so the command called in reinforcements, aviation units capable of quickly reaching the conflict site. Helicopters roared overhead among the trees. The fight continued for a long time, without a moment's pause, until finally the enemy's artillery fell silent. When the smoke cleared and the combat helicopters withdrew to the side, American troops cautiously approached the edge of the delta to assess the situation. Initially, it seemed that the Viet Cong guerrillas had once again managed to escape into the dense jungle, dissolving into the misty greenery of the tropical foliage. However, after some time, they spotted a body lying nearby, with documents found on it indicating affiliation with a local force battalion numbered 506. This was a clear sign that the enemy had left traces behind. Then they found another dead Viet Cong fighter, and shortly after, yet another. By the time everything was tallied, the number of enemies destroyed approached 60. The Delta, territory once controlled by Viet Cong guerrillas, had now fallen under American control. Having absorbed their new strength and dominance over the Mekong River, the Naval River Force, Mobile River Forces, prepared for the next phase of the campaign in the Coronado area, an operation called Coronado 5, which began in early September 1967. At first glance, the mission seemed simple. Land American and South Vietnamese battalions near the suspected hideouts of the main Viet Cong Force Battalion number 263 and drive the enemy out of the area forever. However, the terrain proved to be extremely challenging and dangerous. Narrow channels and straits hindered the mobile river units from using most of their vessels in the operation. The enemy had to push through mud, destroyed trails and vine-covered ditches stretching across the entire Vietnamese tropical forest. Fortunately for the American forces, they did not have to go very far. Soon after the start of the offensive, soldiers encountered an enemy unit guarding their rear. It was a familiar scene. Viet Cong guerrillas, noticing the approaching opponents, tried to scatter, dispersing their forces. They rushed into rice fields, hoping to hide in the thickets, but then helicopters arrived, carrying groups of South Vietnamese paratroopers who immediately began firing at the enemy, releasing tracers. Meanwhile, American armored personnel carriers and infantry surrounded the enemy with a dense curtain of fire, grenade launcher bursts, volleys from large-caliber machine guns, and mortar salvos. Many Viet Cong fighters fell on the spot, trapped between the rivers and the jungle, with no chance to escape. But the victory was not complete. Many enemies managed to disappear into the thick undergrowth, slipping away in front of the Americans. U.S. command suspected that the remaining enemies might have taken refuge in one of the region's largest strongholds near the Cam Son River. Rumor had it that fighters from the famous Viet Cong Battalion, number 514, were gathering and hiding there, preparing for new attacks. The Americans were obliged to eliminate this resistance hub, and once again, the mobile river forces found themselves on the front line. A group of ships known as artillery transport vessels, ATC, was sent into the operation. As they sailed along the river, the crew had to pass through a bend called Snoopy's Nose. This area was particularly dangerous, as the enemy could detect the movement of the Americans and thus sabotage the entire operation. Therefore, the helicopters in the air were kept to a minimum, and the artillery ceased fire to avoid revealing their position. All participants in the operation remained silent as the ships slowly navigated the winding section of the river. It seemed that piercing sounds of rockets, launched from behind the trees on both sides of the river, echoed like fierce war cries, accompanied by the thunder of machine gun fire, tearing through the silence and creating an atmosphere of chaos and danger. The water immediately surged and splashed as bullets of varying speed and force struck its surface, transforming the calm smoothness into a sea of spray and waves. Some combat boats, trying to avoid collisions, sharply turned and maneuvered to maintain course and control. Some aimed to advance further despite the danger, while others made sudden turns to seek cover from enemy fire and prepare for a new attack. On board these combat vessels were groups of heavily armed fighters, automatic rifles, grenade launchers, and mortars, all deployed to repel the enemy. But due to the dense smoke and fire fog, visibility was nearly zero, and commanders could not clearly see the situation. As a result, communication between the teams was almost completely broken at the very start of the battle, leading to total chaos. There was no time for coordination and no opportunity to warn neighboring patrols of the approaching danger. Despite this, the ships continued moving forward, unaware that they were literally heading into the zone of death, the so-called kill zone. Those who managed to dodge enemy fire, barely understanding the situation, saw mines explode beneath them, flooding the river with deafening blasts. The water around them foamed and boiled, as if the river itself had come alive, detonating from powerful mine explosions set by the enemy. At that moment, the command issued an order to retreat. It was time to withdraw and stop the reckless attack. Gradually, one after another, the damaged boats began to leave the battlefield, their crews pulling back to preserve their lives. Nearly half of the entire fleet was damaged, and over 800 people were wounded or seriously injured. However, the forces stationed on the Mekong were not willing to surrender so easily or abandon the river. Once the danger had passed and the hazardous area was no longer within direct fire range, the remaining ships were immediately repaired, rearmed, and sent back into battle just a few hours later. This time, when the frontline boats bypassed Snoopy's nose, they were prepared for any challenge. As soon as the jungle was once again illuminated by fire and the enemy opened fire on the ships, they responded with powerful gunfire, sparing neither bullets nor shells. Helicopters with guns circled overhead, unleashing supporting fire, while the gunners on the decks opened volleys of tracers that pierced through the enemy defenses and ensured a safe landing for the troops. Once ashore, the American soldiers began the final phase of the attack, which lasted several days. During this time, they carried out a series of air and ground strikes to completely eliminate all hideouts and bases of enemy fighters hiding in the area. As a result of the operation, over 200 enemy fighters were killed or destroyed, and American casualties numbered only 16. The victory in this battle belonged to the Marine and Riverine forces, the Mobile Riverine Force, who achieved victory that day. However, each soldier was haunted by a troubling thought. The enemy was learning quickly and improving. If American forces made mistakes or missed opportunities again, sooner or later the enemy would be able to regain control over the rivers and canals, reclaiming them for themselves. In the months following the near-fatal ambush at Snappy Nose, American river units began active efforts to clear the territory. Powerful ships with iron hulls, armored personnel carriers, and monitors re-entered the area. Dozens of fortified positions were captured by the enemy, and by mid-January, the enemy had already lost over 400 fighters killed or destroyed. Gradually, the tension began to subside, and a sense of calm returned to the air, slowly restoring peace to the Delta. By early 2006, the situation was gradually stabilizing. Weapons were lowered, even if just for a moment. The enemy was pushed back, and now the troops had the opportunity to rest, catch their breath, and celebrate their victory. Meanwhile, South Vietnamese allies who fought side by side with the Americans began returning to their home provinces to mark Tet, the Lunar New Year. This holiday became a de facto ceasefire for both sides, a kind of lull that allowed all participants in the conflict at least a little relief. However, a few hours before Tet began, when fireworks started exploding across cities throughout South Vietnam, American soldiers suddenly sensed that something was wrong. Suddenly, they looked at each other in confusion, because the sounds of explosions that had previously only come from the sky now also echoed from the surrounding streets. Before they could even grab their weapons, the soldiers found themselves under fire. The enemy, the Viet Cong, had returned for blood to exact revenge. The Tet offensive erupted across South Vietnam like a wildfire. Enemy forces infiltrated major cities, and provincial centers came under attack. In the city of My Tho, even President Nguyen Van Thieu found himself trapped inside his own house as the enemy. Viet Cong fighters quickly seized the region, capturing key strategic points in the army with astonishing speed. While this large-scale attack was unfolding across the country, the armored boats of the Mobile River forces continued their patrols, conducting routine radar sweeps along the banks of the Mekong Delta. Suddenly, from every radio receiver, as if by command, identical messages began to come through. All units were urgently needed everywhere at once. However, this time, unlike usual operations, the river ships were not sent into the jungles or remote areas. Their orders were to merge into the hot spots of urban combat. These ships had never before been assigned such tasks, yet refusal was impossible. Armored boats, armed vehicles, and trucks quickly headed straight into the heart of the fighting, while helicopters roared overhead, dropping troops directly onto the tangled and dangerous streets. Warriors stormed alleys and courtyards, firing artillery and machine guns at all enemy strongholds they encountered. The battles raged non-stop. Each neighborhood, each street had to be cleared. Then quickly they would return to the ships, shrouded in smoke, blood, and sweat. The soldiers were exhausted but refused to surrender. Time and again, they were sent back into the fight to capture new cities and continue the struggle. After several weeks of continuous combat, it became clear that the situation was spiraling out of control. The Viet Cong enemies had no intention of surrendering. They skillfully retreated into encirclements and launched attacks from cover, hiding in the foliage. Then the command realized that the only way to end the bloodshed was to deliver a final, crushing blow. The date of this decisive offensive was set for February 6th. Before dawn, an armored company of soldiers boarded a column of armored boats and silently entered the canals surrounding the city of Vinh Long. The Americans split their forces, with two separate groups moving from opposite flanks. After disembarking, they were to advance into the city, encircling the enemy from all sides. Among them was a young soldier, Specialist Thomas James Kinsman. He stood inside an armored vehicle, gripping his weapon tightly, when suddenly the boat sharply accelerated. At that moment, the water around them was violently torn apart by powerful explosions as enemy shells crashed into the surface with a thunderous roar. The crew quickly dropped to the deck, pressing close to the hull, trying to hold their position as securely as possible in cover. The captain, hiding behind armor protection, persistently ordered the advance at full speed, while maneuvering his vehicle to avoid traps set across narrow channel straits. As the hatch lowered and the landing party reached the shore, Kinsman and his group found themselves in the mud. Thick bushes blocked their view, and within seconds the soldiers lost sight of each other. However, despite this, Kinsman did not stop, continuing to move forward. His hand tightly gripped his weapon, his heart was pounding wildly, and his eyes carefully watched every shadow and movement around him. Soldiers around him rustled in scattered formation, trying to maintain order amid the chaos of battle. Suddenly, a grenade flew through the air and landed with a dull thud right in front of the advancing group. Without hesitation, Kinsman shouted to his comrades to lie down, and he himself rushed toward the grenade to cover them. The explosion tore through his chest and limbs, but his body acted as a shield, absorbing the impact and protecting those behind him. He barely survived afterward, but his self-sacrifice saved the entire group. Realizing that his comrade had died for their sake, the American soldiers pulled themselves together and charged forward with fury and determination. Soon, the remaining units arrived at the scene. Their weapons sounded with a deafening roar as they searched the surroundings. Other squads surrounded the enemy from the flanks, while small riverboats shelled nearby trees, blocking all possible escape routes for the enemy. But as darkness fell, silence settled in the jungle. The enemy forces, the Viet Cong, disappeared once again, as if they had never been there. In the following months, the mobile river forces continued to push deeper into the waterways of South Vietnam. During this time, over 600 miles of rivers were patrolled and secured, numerous enemy strongholds were destroyed, entire battalions scattered, and by midsummer, nearly 700 enemy fighters had been killed in clashes along the canals and rivers. No matter how far the American forces swam or how many combat engagements they won, the enemy constantly found ways to vanish. The Viet Cong skillfully avoided American advances, hiding among civilians and in villages, or slipping upstream to regroup and strike again a week later. New offensives erupted across South Vietnam once more, and cities that previously seemed well protected were again subjected to attack. Thousands of American soldiers and officers had fallen, and a clear victory was nowhere in sight. In 1970, 3 years after the start of river patrols in the Mekong Delta, the United States began gradually withdrawing its forces. Armored boats were decommissioned and their crews sent home, leaving the mission unfinished. Just 2 years later, North Vietnamese forces entered Saigon, and the south of the country collapsed. The Mekong Delta, once guarded by the bravest and most determined fleet during the war, ended up in enemy hands. Everything that the mobile river forces fought so hard to defend was lost, and control over this region passed to the enemy.